These are tough times for marketers. Costs are rising, including advertising costs. I'll explain why advertising costs in a recession can be the deal of the century. In the last two sections, I looked at how costs are rising and how that's squeezing margins and therefore deterring advertisers from investing. Well, advertising costs are rising too, aren't they? Well, yes, but let's drill a little further into the data. We need to think about how costs are changing in real terms. Look at the chart on the left. This shows the real cost per thousand ever since 1965. And what you can see from this chart is that for the last 20 years or so, the real cost per thousand has been steadily falling. And in fact, the cost of reaching people with TV is now at more or less its lowest level ever since the data began in 1965. So, yes, nominal prices might be going up, but the real cost of reaching people has been going down, particularly for fixed inventory media like TV. And the good news is that it tends to fall even faster during a recession. If we look at the real cost per thousand for TV during previous recessions, we see that in almost every case, there's been a sharp reduction in the real cost of reaching people with TV. The one exception was the 1981 recession. My guess is that while nominal TV prices might rise this year, we can expect to see the real cost of TV, the real cost of buying eyeballs with TV, fall in 2023. Now, an interesting way to look at this is to compare the cost of reaching people with those top-line revenues that I talked about in the first video. As I said in the first video, we can expect top-line revenues to rise for most brands and firms in Britain this year, even if there's a recession. And for some sectors like FMCG, we can expect them to be quite healthy. If we think about it in terms of the ratio of consumer spending to the cost of buying eyeballs, that gives you a kind of value for money index, closely linked to ROI. And I've plotted that value for money index here for TV going all the way back to 1965. As you can see, value for money has been rising pretty steadily over that point and strongly for the last 20 years. And now look what happens with each of the recessions. In the 70s, when we had the oil price shock, somewhat similar to the energy shock we're seeing now, value for money increased. TV was a good buy in the 1970s recession. In the 1980s, it was so-so. In the 1990s recession, which in many ways is the closest to the one we see now, inflation 9-10%, rather like now, interest rates rising rather like they are now, TV became better value for money. We saw a significant increase in TV ROI in the 91 recession. In the 2001 crisis, which was not quite a full-blown recession in the UK, again, we saw an increase in value for money. In 2009, the global financial crisis, TV became a good buy. And during COVID, despite the enormous contraction in consumer spending in some sectors, TV prices fell faster than top-line revenues, and so we saw TV reaching really high value for money during the COVID recession. And for firms that could afford it and were doing relatively well during COVID, TV really was the bargain of the century. And a good example there is Unilever. Unilever, working in FMCG, which as we see tends to do relatively well during recession, Unilever realized that low TV rates, high FMCG revenues meant that there was a buying opportunity for a firm like Unilever during COVID. they took advantage of it, they piled in, and they reaped the rewards. I think something similar is going to happen this year. For those firms whose profit margins are robust, who work in sectors that are relatively buoyant, there will be a buying opportunity this year. There's a chance to exploit cheap media, and particularly if your competitors are foolish enough to cut their budgets sharply, a chance to buy share of voice and market share cheaply. So if you can afford it, this might be the year to exploit cheap share of voice.